If you need, say, $35,000 to buy a car, you can go to your friendly banker and say, I'd like to borrow $35,000 to buy a car, and he or she will say, well, what collateral have you got? And you can say, well, I have some stocks or bonds, but if you don't have those, say, well, what about a second mortgage on your house or cottage? And failing that, how about the co-signature of a rich relative or mother-in-law or someone? And finally, you satisfy the collateral requirements, and your friendly banker says that's fine, gives you a note to sign. And the note is repayable fully in due time, or probably on demand. And the interest rate is prime plus 1 or 1.5%, depending on the color of your eyes. And as soon as this is agreed and you sign the note, the banker taps the computer keys and presto, $35,000 appears in your bank account that you can go out and spend to buy the car. Now, seconds earlier, that money did not exist. It was created out of thin air, so to speak. There's a myth, of course, circulating, and it's propagated by bankers and others, that if you go in to borrow $35,000, that's money that I or somebody else deposited the day before. But the chance of that being true is infinitesimal. The banks are fully lent at all times, practically all times, and so if you go in to borrow money, they create it for you out of nothing. The first governor of the Bank of Canada said that money was just a book entry. If he were alive today, he would say it's just a computer entry. That's all it is. So the principal problem with bank-created money is that it's all created as debt. Debt on which interest has to be paid. So what happens if no one creates any money with which to pay the interest? Well, the answer is we have to borrow money in order to pay the interest and go deeper and deeper into debt. So if you look around the world and see all of the countries that are so far in debt, including our own, it's not primarily due to the profligate spending of politicians. Well, sometimes they get a little careless with the taxpayers' money, but so do big corporations. It is primarily because of the system, which is based on creating money, most of it, as debt. The system is like a balloon, and the private banks pump debt into the balloon, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually the debt is so high that we can't carry the interest anymore, and then it's like a balloon with a pin stuck in it. It goes shh, and you have a recession or a depression. Well, I'm a child of the Great Depression, so I remember it well. Farmers with buildings in need of repair and wives without decent clothes because they couldn't sell their produce. Carpenters out of work who needed both food and clothing. Needleworkers out of work who needed food and home repairs. They all needed something, but none of them could get what they needed because they didn't have the cash to do it. Well, there were many theories about the reason for the Depression. Most of us have been raised to believe that it was just part of a cyclical economic system, and that there is really no recourse except to grin and bear it. That view is reinforced by the economics profession. And it was the fact that I couldn't accept their rationale that caused me to enter politics more than 60 years ago. I asked them if recessions and depressions were necessary and never got a straight answer. It was always a reference to economic history. There have been recessions and depressions, so by extension, just like the weather, you're going to have recessions and depressions from time to time. Well, I didn't believe it. I worked my own way through it, came to the conclusion that there were monetary phenomena, and that not one of the 25 recessions or depressions that we've had since 1890 has been necessary. Not one. The real reason for the Great Depression was unearthed by Ferdinand Pecora, chief counsel for the U.S. Senate Banking and Currency Committee that held hearings in the waning months of the Hoover presidency and the early days of the New Deal. This is a quote from the New York Times op-ed. Under Pecora's expert and often withering questions, the Senate committee unearthed the secret financial history of the 1920s, demystifying the assorted frauds, scams, and abuses that culminated in the 1929 crash. It wasn't an accident of history. It was, according to Pecora, a coldly deliberated action to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Well, the reaction of the Great Depression varied from country to country. In Canada, there was a demand for a central bank, and the Bank of Canada was chartered. At first privately owned, when it was formed in 1934, it was nationalized by Mackenzie King when he came to power in 1935. It didn't do very much for a while. In 1938, as I remember well from personal experience, there were no jobs available in Canada, none, no job openings. Then war broke out in 1939, and pretty soon everyone was working. Some people joined the armed forces, others built factories and made munitions. So you might ask, where did they get the money to pay for all this stuff? Well, the answer is, the Bank of Canada printed it. P-R-I-N-T-E-D, it. That's where it came from.